Hey folks, before we get started today, I wanted to let you know that what you're about to watch is actually an edited version of this episode. Due to YouTube's policies, we weren't able to post the entire interview on this site. I apologize for any choppiness and any missing information. I really hope you enjoy the rest of the show. Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen Haupt, and I'm joined today by Dr. Angela Lanfranchi. Welcome to our podcast.
It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. And I know you've done a lot of research and talked about the correlation between contraception and breast cancer. Can you just give a little bit of background to our listeners about how you got involved in this research and why you started talking about it?
Well, in the 80s, when I started to do, actually, it was the 90s when I started to do more and more breast surgery and eventually limited my surgical practice to breast surgery. I became concerned because I saw a lot of women in their 30s with breast cancer. And when I had left medical school, in 75, it was grandma who got breast cancer, and it was a postmenopausal disease. They were older women, and yet in 1 month, I saw 3 30-year-olds that didn't have the BRCA mutation and a genetic reason to have breast cancer. So, it was really heartbreaking because all 3 of them had young children, like in there, that were 2, 3 years old. So I started looking into risk factors. And I always had on my intake form, exposure to hormones, things like that. But the reproductive history was just how many times were you pregnant? How many kids did you have? And so, at that point, a tear is coming to my eye because I realized she knew about it all along. She just didn't want to address the subject. And so it wasn't long, maybe 3 weeks after that, Joel Bryn called me up and said, hey, do you want to start a nonprofit? And the Breast Cancer Prevention Institute, we can talk about those issues and we could lower the incidence of breast cancer because you can't prevent a lot of it. There are modifiable risk factors. So I was so annoyed at Judy that I decided that was a great idea. So actually, our Breast Cancer Prevention Institute started at the 1999 April meeting of HLI in Toronto, where me, Joel Bryn, John Bruchalski, and Bill Toffler, we made up the first board members of the Breast Cancer Prevention Institute. We got incorporated, and next year we're going to be 25 years old. So we've been doing research and putting out literature and presenting papers about this and trying to educate the public and doctors and things like that. So we've had an interesting 25 years.
Well, thank you for doing that. And then for our listeners who just might not know that much about how breast cancer develops, can you give super layman, easy version of how breast cancer develops so they have that context going forward in this conversation?
Okay. So we've known since the Middle Ages that having a child was protective against you getting breast cancer. So at that point, only nuns got breast cancer because they were largely childless. So what is it about that? So if you look at cigarette smoke. Does smoking increase the risk of breast cancer? Well, the studies were all over the map. Some studies said yes, some studies said no, and some studies said it actually lowered. So, what was happening? Well, it turns out that there was a very smart Canadian doctor. And what he did, he separated women looking at smoking based on whether or not they had had a child. And if you had a child and smoked, what your risk was about a 69% increased risk. But if you hadn't had a child, it was about a 640% increased risk. It was huge. So it makes a big difference. So exactly what is happening in your breast? So everybody knows that as soon as they get pregnant, their breasts start to get bigger, right? And they get sore and tender. That was an early sign of pregnancy. And Robin Williams used to say he always knew when his wife got pregnant because the breast fairy would visit. And so what's happening? Well, as soon as conception occurred, and you just have a few cell embryo floating down the fallopian tube, it actually secretes HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, and that's what the dipstick test for pregnancy is now. So HCG tells the mother's ovaries to put out a huge amount of estrogen and progesterone. And when that happens, your breasts start to grow. But what's growing? So when you're born, you have a few rudimentary breast lobules. That's a unit of breast tissue with a duct and some glands, or things that'll turn into the glands. And so you're born with type 1 lobules. And then you go through puberty, and your breasts start to grow because you start having a menstrual cycle. And then at the end of puberty, about 75% of your breast tissue is type 1 lobules, and 25% are type 2, a little more developed. But what's bad about that is type 1 lobules are where 85% of all breast cancers start. Those are ductal cancers. They start in the milk duct. And about 25, the other percent, the type 2 lobules is where lobular cancers start. That's about 15%. So now you're pregnant, your breasts are growing, but what they're making more of is type 1 and 2 lobules until 20 weeks. So you've doubled the amount of breast tissue, but they're targets for where breast cancers can start. And then what happens? Well, then the embryo starts putting out more human placental lactogen, HPL, because it wants to make that tissue into tissue that can make milk for the baby. And so that starts going up after HCG really goes back down. And as time goes on between that 20 weeks at the middle of your full-term pregnancy, at 20 weeks, your breasts stop getting bigger, but that HPL makes them differentiate. And they start turning that breast tissue into tissue that can make milk. And that happens up to around 32 weeks. Before 32 weeks, all you have is breasts that have more places for cancers to start. And because there is more tissue with more places for cancer to start, you have a higher risk for breast cancer. But then something magic happens at 32 weeks, where the HPL starts to level off, but more and more lobules get differentiated into type 4 lobules that produce the milk. And that's what gives you the protective effect of a full-term pregnancy. So everybody agrees that if you have a preterm birth before 32 weeks, it doubles your breast cancer risk. Everybody agrees that if you have a full-term pregnancy, you have a lower risk. Your risk goes up about 3% for every week's gestation until 32 weeks. If you give birth after 32 weeks, but before a full-term pregnancy, you still get a protective effect, but it's less about 10% less than if you go full term.
That's interesting. So basically, your breast tissue, when it's like immature in a sense for the type 1 and 2, that's where you're most likely to have cancer start. And so up until those cells start turning, or the tissue starts turning into the type 4, that you're just like, as your breast tissue grows, it's increasing that risk. And then once it turns into the protective type, that's when you'll be safe. So basically, if the pregnancy ends before 30, you said 32 weeks, that's going to increase your risk for breast cancer. But then if it continues all the way, it'll be safe.
Yeah.
Safer. Interesting.
Isn't it? And all that breast physiology is well documented. I mean, Irma and Jose Russo, which were two Argentinian researchers, that their last place where they worked was down in Philadelphia. And I used to talk to them, and they've asked me to come down and give a lecture, and they came up to our place and gave a lecture, and I knew them pretty well. And they're the ones that found that there was that basis. Irma told me that, you know how they have rat models of different diseases so they can experiment on the rats and not people?
Yes.
So there's a rat called the Sprague Dolly rat. And she was buying some. And the person she was buying it from said, if you're going to do breast cancer research with these rats, make sure that they don't get pregnant first. Mm. And so she said, So there was a chemical that they could give the rats and reliably produce breast cancer in them so they can study the cancers. So what she did was she gave rats with a litter of pups that chemical. The rats that got the chemicals after they had a litter of pups didn't get breast cancer because they were mature. Well, think about God's great design for this reason. One of the things that happens when you're pregnant, so whenever cells rapidly multiply, like the breast does getting bigger when you get pregnant, you have to quickly copy all that DNA so that you can have a copy of the DNA in the cell and then split the cell and have two cells. That's how you grow. And so you're copying what's like a book really, really fast. So you know you're going to make a mistake. So the more rapidly you proliferate, the higher your risk of making a mutation. And if the mutations build up or you make a critical mutation is one that gives you cancer just from the get-go. It's like leaving the word not out of a sentence. It completely changes the whole meaning of that sentence. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that's a dangerous part. And you would think that women would get more breast cancer, right? Mm-hmm. Well, they actually don't. They actually, for every birth, they lower their risk another 10%.
Wow.
So why is that? Well, it's because the embryo, the fetus, is also producing a protein called inhibin. And inhibin is a cancer suppressor. It helps you fix any mutations that you have. So that's an example how fearfully and wonderfully you're made. At the time that you're most vulnerable, the fetus is making it so that it's lowering your risk of getting breast cancer. And what's really interesting is, HCG also made by the fetus, right? It's not made by the mother. When they're using HCG to inject into breast cancers that have been biopsied and proven breast cancers, and the breast cancers regress. That was more research that was being done by the Russos when they passed on. So it's really interesting.
That's fascinating. Yeah. And
It
how
is, isn't it?
it is. Yeah. And then can you speak a little bit to how contraceptives and birth control affect breast cancer and development, especially in young girls, but in anybody who uses it?
Well, so when's the worst time to take hormonal contraception?
I'm guessing in young girls, right?
Right, because their breasts are already growing.
Mm-hmm.
So you may or may not know this, but hormonal contraceptives have been classified as group 1 carcinogens, meaning they absolutely cause breast, cervical, and liver cancers in humans, by the World Health Organization's International Agency on Research of Cancer. So if you Google IARC monograph 91, you'll go to a site where you can actually download that and get all the data showing that it's a carcinogen. So there are 2 mechanisms biologically that make it carcinogenic in humans for breast. One is that it causes your breast cells to proliferate. So you know how 7 to 10 days before your periods, your breasts start to hurt you?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's because after you ovulate, you make a corpus luteum in the ovary, and it produces progesterone. So now you have estrogen and progesterone around. You need both of them together to make your breast cells proliferate. So we just spoke about proliferation. You have to copy a bunch of DNA real fast. And you can make a mutation, and those mutations build up, or you make a critical mutation and you have cancer. That's one way. The other way is that the estrogen is a ringed organic molecule that's got, 6-sided rings that are kind of lapped together. Mm-hmm. And there's 21 carbons. If you metabolize at the 4th carbon, you produce a genotoxin, 4-hydroxycatechol-estrogen-quinone. And we know that there are purine bases in DNA, and the purines make the rung of the ladder. It actually pulls purine bases out of DNA chains. So it's a direct carcinogen. And that's why the National Toxicology Advisory Panel, which is part of our federal government, listed estrogen on its list of carcinogens at the same time they listed, wood dust giving you nasopharyngeal cancers. So those are the 2 biological mechanisms. And if you just think about it, people know the longer you have menstrual cycles, the longer they are. So you have menarche not when you're 13, but when you're 9. And then the longer you have the cycles, you go through menopause, not at 52, but at 60. You have all those extra years. That increases your risk. Early menarche, late menopause increases your risk of breast cancer. That's because every time you go through a menstrual cycle, you're proliferating your breast tissue.
Okay.
And you're making mutations. And if all that breast tissue is immature because you didn't have a kid yet, maybe, then it's really bad. So estrogen is very potent, and it's so potent it's measured in parts per trillion. And there's a big ecologic problem that goes on, because if you have a water treatment plant where they take the water that you flush down the toilet that has urine in it, Well, they're good at taking the bacteria out before they dump it into the river, but they're not taking your birth control pill out. So when your ovary secretes estrogen, one passed through the liver and it's metabolized. Mm-hmm. So you can't be popping pills all day. So they make a synthetic estrogen that's really hard to metabolize. And the only way to really get it out of your body is to pee it out in the urine. So think about this. There's enough birth control pill, estrogen, in the effluent from the water treatment plant, the sewage treatment plant, that when it gets in the river, downstream, it ruins fisheries. Mm-hmm. All these fish have ambiguous genitalia and they can't procreate. I mean, when you think about how much water there is in a river and it's flowing and that amount of estrogen is going to mess up the fish, you know that you're dealing with an incredibly potent drug.
Yeah. So basically the estrogen in contraceptives and birth control, it increases the estrogen in your body, which is what will cause your cells to proliferate and cause and break down and potentially have cancer. Is that kind of generally?
Yeah. It's one is that when it's possible that some of it is broken down at the fourth carbon, mm-hmm. where it creates a carcinogen, catechol-estrogen-quinone, but most of the effect that's carcinogenic is what you said. With the proliferation, you make mutations that will build up and cause cancer.
How is that different than just the estrogen your body naturally makes? Is there a difference, or is it just that you're putting?
Well, that's what I was saying to you. You think of estrogen as this wonderful thing that allows women to be women, to get breasts, have kids. Mm-hmm. But the more you're exposed to it in your lifetime, the higher your risk.
Okay.
So that's the point I was making with the more cycles you have.
Yeah.
It's natural. You're doing something natural. You're having a menstrual cycle. But it does involve proliferating your breast tissue.
Okay. So there's going to be a risk either way. It's just with contraceptives, you're increasing that risk more because you're putting it in your body regularly.
You have estrogen in your body even after menopause because your fat makes it. Okay. That's why postmenopausal obesity increases breast cancer risk because you have all that extra fat making estrogen. And estrogen is going to cause you to get, too much of a good thing. Can cause a problem.
That makes sense. I just wanted to make sure that I understood exactly what you were saying with that. So anyway, do you have anything else you'd like to share with our listeners on this subject today before we wrap up?
About what? About
either all the topics we've been talking about with breast cancer and reproductive health, all of that.
Well, you could think about the young girls that got, usually teenagers have irregular cycles. Irregular cycles are fewer cycles, so it actually is protective of breast cancer. So mother will say, okay, you're having irregular cycles. I'll take you to the doctor and we'll fix that up. And they give you the pill. Or you have acne and they'll give you the pill. Or you have painful periods and they'll give you the pill. All those things can be treated by other drugs that aren't group 1 carcinogens. We won't trust you to take a pill every day. So let's give you the Depo-Provera shot. And we only have to capture you every 3 months for that. And Depo-Provera doubles your risk of breast cancer. So it's like a double whammy for those women. So you have 9 million women taking the pill and another 3 million women taking the other formulations. So you have 12 million women in this country taking hormonal contraceptives. 85% of women in this country have taken them at some time in their lifetime. And that's why you have an extra 452,000 cases of breast cancer a year that's attributable to hormonal contraceptives. It's crazy.
Yeah, that is
so
crazy.
you can get all that information at the website, the Breast Cancer Prevention Institute website, and you can download it for free.
Awesome. Well, not awesome that it happens, but awesome that that information's out there.
But there, a group of doctors and PhDs got together called the Contraceptive Study Group, and it was put together by Dr. William Williams.
Okay.
And we put together an FDA petition and submitted it in May of 2019. And we showed all of the diseases that you get from hormonal contraceptives. And we asked them to change the labeling of the insert of the manufacturer and for the patient so that people would be aware of these risks. There's over 1 million excess cases of diseases caused by the pill, even taking into the account the reduction that you could have in ovarian and endometrial cancer. And the cost of treating all those diseases is $16.8 billion a year.
Wow.
So there's a lot of disease, and a lot of people don't know about the things like systemic lupus and Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis and osteoporosis and all the cardiovascular effects like strokes, pulmonary emboli, and things like that, heart attacks. They don't realize that. So that entire petition with all the data is also on our website. And about a year ago, the FDA responded in terms of breast cancer risk. And they said, oh, okay, new studies have come out, and so we're going to change the manufacturer's insert this way to reflect this new data.
Wow. At least they've admitted that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really interesting topic of conversation. I'm really glad to have your expertise talking about it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And to all of our listeners, please like, follow, subscribe, whether you're listening on YouTube, Rumble, or any of our audio platforms. Share with your friends and keep on living the culture of life. Thank you and God bless.